Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Here we are on a Friday night, bit of a special occasion. And for those people who aren't watching the Cowboys versus Warriors, welcome. Nanette, how are you?
I'm well, thank you, Brenton. And this is our week 7 of high humidity. And I keep saying this every week, but we're getting more and more interest in the show. And I've had a few more people contact me and want to come onto the show to talk about matters related to Central and North Queensland. So I'm very excited by the progress we're making in trying to get the North Queensland and Central Queensland voices out there. So thank you to all our supporters, and please feel free to circulate any of our interviews and certainly promote us, because we are here for you, and we're trying to communicate all matters Central and North Queensland. And on that note, Brendan, it's been quite an interesting week for us in the north. I mean, well, in Queensland generally, we announcement today that the border's opening up on the 10th of July.
Yeah.
Good news to many, I would imagine.
Yeah, look, it's obviously I think the push was to wait until September, and everyone was getting pretty anxious at the fact that you've got so many businesses that were still suffering. You've got tourism that's really suffering. Funnily enough, the industries that always seem to be under pressure from one side of politics, the agricultural industry and the mining industry, have gone strong, and I think will continue to prosper in these uncertain times and pushing forward. Obviously, everyone needs to eat, and everyone needs things out of the ground to make.
Absolutely. I've said all along, I think the resource sector is going to get us out of our very deep debt hole in relation to all this. And so we'll talk about that later when we speak with our invited guests. But today is also the 24th anniversary of the Black Hawk tragedy, which I actually remember because I am a Townsville girl, where 18 men died when 2 Black Hawks that were in training at high range collided. The 3 men from 5th Aviation died, and 15 men from the Perth-based Special Air Service Regiment died. And they're being remembered. They were remembered today in a special service. So it's we've got such history, we've got such diversity, and the other bit of good news, I think, especially for those who are watching footy right now, may watch this show later. Stadiums now can open, but not to full capacity. I think the ruling is that 25% of the seating capacity can be filled up with people. So I think that means about 6,250 in Townsville Stadium. Some other bigger stadiums might be able to hold a few more. So that's really good news, isn't it?
Does that mean the stadiums in New South Wales will be able to get to 6,000 also? Because
10,000. Some of them are much bigger than our stadium, even though our stadium's beautiful, and I won't make any complaints. But
I'm actually saying, because normally they only get about 5,000 people there anyway. So
yeah, that's right. I should have listened. Yeah, no. And of course, there's other news today. I think Scott Morrison got himself in a little bit of strife with his comments that there's been no slavery in Australia.
Yeah, it's a very dumb comment, and it's a very the topic of the whole Black Lives Matter and everything. It's such a precious thing, because obviously everyone's got different point of views, and probably the thing that people don't understand is different circumstances for different people. So like, if I've got some friends out there obviously from the Indigenous community, and their points of view on it are different to people who haven't had that sort of history in their in their family, and so it's very I think Scott will regret that to come out and say something like that.
I think he has. I read a recent sort of bit of a semi-retraction. He was saying he was trying to refer to New South Wales, but we have an incredible history. And then I know that when I was at school, we weren't necessarily, and I'm 50 years of age, we weren't necessarily taught about the massacres across our nation that occurred. And even the history of Townsville, along with Robert Towns and his blackbirding, because he was, a man who was, an entrepreneur. I mean, he had one fleeting visit here, but he poured a lot of money into the area to establish it as a port to export a lot of the goods that are particularly in the Woodstock farming area. And, you know, he was a participant in blackbirding, and blackbirding, you know, is exactly that. It's a form of slavery, and we can't, you know, our South Sea Islander heritage people, you know, you've got hold on to that history, which for some of them is still, you know, part of their, you know, conversation as a family, and in their, you know, history that's not that far away, you know, historically.
Yeah,
so
and it isn't that far. And this is again, like, there'll be people out there going, you know, who will have a comment on it, and again, that's up to them to make those sort of comments. But
yeah,
you know, like I've got a guy that I call a good mate, and you know, to hear his history from it, you know, it was only his grandfather. You know, it was. I hope I get this right, but my understanding is that he, you know, his grandfather was 12, running a cattle station, obviously part of the stolen generation, and that happened. Like, people can't hide
yeah,
behind that sort of stuff, and
no, we
you
need
know,
to state our history as it is, and
yeah,
we've got to make
and
sure.
that's the thing. Like, and you
mm,
know, some of our history we're proud of, and some of it we shouldn't be proud of, but it is our
that's
history,
right.
and nevertheless,
Yeah,
you know, and probably the disappointing thing, you know, when this sort of thing happens, and it's on a global scale, and um, people all of a sudden uh, seem to get very angry about it, and that's the disappointing thing about it. Like, and as I talked about last week, um,
mm,
you know, there's a lot of other Aboriginal issues that
yeah.
go unnoticed from every day, and all of a sudden, everyone wants to talk about this one, and I
Well,
think,
I'm quite impressed by a lot of what Jacinta Price is saying, and she's a councillor in the Alice Springs area. And if anyone's very interested in a perspective, which, you know, I align with strongly, you know, she was talking about. I listened to one of her interviews, and she was talking about the fact that the incarcerated Indigenous in this country, 70% of them are incarcerated due to violence or violent acts. And she was talking about the high rate of domestic violence, and, you know, terrible domestic violence and abuse of young Indigenous kids. And these are the real issues that we need to speak about. And I know, and you know, that it exists not only in Indigenous communities, that domestic violence is a problem. And, you know, and that's just the tip of some of the things she's talking about, but she's speaking out for her people, which I quite admire. And, you know, being challenged, and sometimes challenged harshly, and perhaps disrespectfully. But these conversations need to happen. They need to occur. We, as such a multicultural country, we need to talk about, you know, the journey that people have taken, and it's so diverse, and we
well,
are so diverse.
you know, well, that's true. Like, you know, Australians are an incredible race of people. You know, it's
Yeah.
you know, and it is, again, I'll reiterate, you know, people, you know, as we move forward, everyone, I think, I honestly thought, until probably in the last week or so, I've honestly thought, yeah, to be honest, I was a bit disappointed with how the carry on's gone on. You know, obviously the whole the whole Black Lives Matter, the you know, the deaths in custody, all that sort of stuff. I really wish people probably handled it better, from both sides of the fence. It's not, you
Yeah.
know, I think,
We don't want to create a bigger divide.
well,
We don't
and
want to, you know, we
that's what I'm
don't
trying to
want
get
to.
to.
Yeah.
I don't like the fact that people get so angry. Like, you know, like, obviously, like I said before, people, we know the history. Some of the history people aren't proud of, but we've got to
And
keep
some of
flipping.
the history people are not aware of as well,
Yeah,
because the
100%.
dominant story told isn't, you know, it doesn't have. I mean, but that goes with a lot of histories. A lot of, you know, histories are, you know, and it takes,
The,
you know, real
the
attention
pyramids,
to make
the
sure it comes
pyramids
to the
they were
fore.
done with slaves. You know, like.
Yeah.
But people look at
Yeah.
the pyramids and go, "Oh, how good are they?" And but, like, I wonder how many people would be disappointed with how that went on. So again,
Yeah.
it's, you know, it's probably not my place to sort of talk about it, but yeah, I just
I
wish
think
more
we're all
people.
entitled to an opinion and all entitled to keep asking questions and all entitled to keep discussing this, because the more we talk about it, the more we will all learn. And that's a healthy thing, and it's very important. I mean, we can't neglect the fact that a lot of inroads have been made in terms of eliminating discrimination of any kind, be it against women or disabled, the community, or even religion. I mean, Australians essentially are, in my opinion, the underpinning premise is that we are egalitarian, we are multicultural, we believe in a fair go, all those values, you know, and we've got to hold on to those and hold on to them strongly, even in tough times like now.
I think you'll find the average Australian, and correct me if I'm wrong here, but the average Australian, they really, everyone wants to be equal, and the only times that people buck up is when they see someone else getting a bigger hand up or a hand out, and that's when you'll see the average Aussie go, well, hang on a minute, you know, what's different to me, what's different to him, and all of a sudden that's when people get angry about it. And so, you know, the message I'd push is, you know, sometimes, you know, just put the swords away and just relax a bit and you know, punch on with.
Oh, that's the fair go attitude that is in our culture, in the way we operate too. We're about giving people a fair go. I know that in my experience in my life, through central North Queensland, where I've spent a majority of my life, except for a couple of years in England, you know, it's been about that. You know, it's about giving people, you know, a fair go, and, you know, valuing difference, embracing difference. And I can tell you right now, if I saw anybody discriminating or you know, being racist, I'd pull them up. And I'm sure you would too. And I know a lot of people that would. And we just need to keep doing that. We need racism, or any form of discrimination, is a learned behaviour. And, you know, we've got to make sure that we stamp out those sorts of learned behaviours that impact upon people in an extremely negative way. And yeah, that's my position. But let's move on, because we've got a very interesting man who's joined us and taken up our invitation to speak with us about the Queensland economy. We decided to reschedule to 7:30 tonight, actually, because Brendan's got himself a brand spanking new job. And yeah, I hope it's going well for you, Brendan. And you know,
it's going quite well. Yeah, no, it's yeah, good start. And yeah, no, it's been really good.
So you're a shift worker now, so yeah. And
no, it's good. You know, the people I'm working with, they're sensational. They've made me feel welcome, and you know, it's obviously a different thing doing shift work. So
yeah.
But in saying that, it's definitely, you know, coming into this industry, it's, you know, the safety focus is quite good. And no, it's only early days, and yeah, no, we'll forge ahead with it. And it's yeah, it's definitely something.
Congratulations and well done, mate. So we'll no doubt you know, move the show to suit your shift work, and that's the beauty of what we've got here. So yeah, so to our viewers, I'm sure there are some of our Saturday noon viewers. We'll still do Saturday noon when we can, but we might shift it to other times as well. But yes, we've got a guest today, as I've stated, Queensland Economist, Dr. Marcus Smith. He is a Townsville-born, raised and educated economist, and he's got a vast experience. More recently, he was the chief economist for the Chamber of Commerce Industry Queensland, but he's also been a lecturer and is a lecturer in finance, and I'll let him tell us more about who he is. But we've got him on the show today in an attempt to try and communicate, you know, each of us in the real world have sort of varying degrees of knowledge about how the economy works. So I'm going to try, Brendan and I are going to try and ask questions that will sort of clarify what's happening in simple terms in our economy, but also, you know, some of the challenges and some of the surprising bits and pieces that Dr. Smith Marcus has got to tell us about. And certainly, as you're watching, you're more than welcome to fire questions, post questions in the stream.
I was going to say that generally, I think especially with an economist, I think it'll be important as we sort of move along to fire the questions in rather than wait to the end of it.
That's right. Yeah.
So yeah, don't be afraid. Flick it in. obviously
we'll watch. So if we look like we've got our heads down, it's because I'll be watching my iPhone,
Yep.
and
So, yeah,
Brendan will be too. So we'll definitely take your questions and fire them to his way, even though we've got some questions that we've already wanting to ask him. So without any further ado, let's bring in Marcus Smith from our waiting room. Just going to admit him now.
Hi, Marcus. How are you, mate?
Hello, Marcus.
Hello. Yep.
Hello, Marcus.
Hello. Good evening.
Welcome to our show, High Humidity. This is week 7, Marcus, and you're our special guest today. So thank you so much for agreeing to join us. So we usually start with, I know you're a Townsville-born lad, so, let's tell us a bit about yourself and your journey and what you do now and sort of the things that you've done up until this point.
For sure. Yeah, so as you know, I'm from Townsville, so I spent probably the first 15 years up in Townsville. My parents owned West Squash Centre when it used to be, well, it's still there along Charles Street. So we had that for over 25 years. So essentially, I was pretty much born around squash and the scene in Townsville. So
you were a pretty good squash player too, weren't you? I'm led to believe you did some representative level stuff.
Yeah, well, we used to travel a lot around because there used to be a lot of tournaments back in the 80s, even up to the 90s before squash sort of died off. But pretty much every weekend we were traveling around North and Central Queensland playing squash. So I went on with that too when I moved to Brisbane and played for a year or so here, and then went overseas and set myself up in Holland. So on the tour, so I toured around the world based there. So I did that for about 2 years. Played Dutch and German leagues there as well. Then spent about another 6 months towards the end of my career there, only about 2.5, 3 years, but in Malaysia in KL.
Yeah, okay.
And then moving on, I've professionally, I came back once I retired, spent 8.5 years at uni doing 3 degrees. So finally got it out of the road. So I started with commerce and sort of found I wasn't really going to be an accountant. So I sort of found economics from there. And since then, I've branched into working professionally as an economist. So once
what is it that you just love about economics?
Well, it's they call economists dry, but we say the same thing about accountants. So I straddle both. So I'm a financial economist. So I've taught at 2 universities. So I spent through my postgrad teaching both finance and economics at Griffith, and then I had a position with JCU, and I still hold an adjunct position, doing a course at the end of the year. But I was the finance professor there for a couple of years before I moved back to Brisbane. I find it sort of very interesting, fascinating. So following the markets and what's going on across the world, and I guess economics affects every part of our lives, and
So you would no doubt find what's happening currently, both state and federally, across the globe, quite interesting, and how we're going to bounce back and kickstart the economy again after a period of serious lockdown and shutdowns, basically. So, look, can we just for our viewers, I think it'd be really important just to ask a couple of basic questions that I'm sure that they will welcome answers to. And the first one is, what does the Queensland government actually spend its money on?
Well, it spends it across a range of things. Predominantly, it manages an operating surplus, which means what it spends in expenses is pretty much, it's a modest one, but pretty much in line with what their revenues are at the moment. Well, until this year, but essentially about 25. They revenues about 60 billion. I can see that being a lot lower this year, obviously, with what's occurred in this financial year. But
just
it's
to
about
put that in perspective. So, what's Australia's GDP per year?
$1.8 trillion dollars.
Yeah.
And the Queensland economy is about 370 billion. So
yeah. Okay. Yeah. Big.
Yeah,
Look,
just to give the listeners a bit of an idea, because when I guess when politicians talk, they just rattle off, oh yeah, that's $1 billion, this is $1 billion, that's $1 billion. The average punter thinks, gee, $1 billion is a lot. And, when they say a dam's $1 billion, people go, oh, we can't afford that. But in the scheme of things, well,
it's all relative, isn't it?
Well, that's right. It's that magnitude. I mean, it's interesting you talk about that, because obviously I deal with trillions and billions and millions predominantly. Really don't end up predominantly with what I do, ending up in the thousands and hundreds. We usually sort of round those off. But essentially, when we're talking about trillions, with the explosion of debt in the world now, it's it's almost a quarter of $2 quadrillion. Like, you haven't heard that term used, but it is approaching very shortly where that term will take over $1 trillion, the way that we're printing money across the world.
And who's that money owed to?
It's owed to a range of people. Governments and banks all own all of this debt. So corporations as well, so it's that's foreign and domestic investors everywhere. So it's spread out predominantly everywhere.
Well, let's just talk for a minute about our investors. I mean, I think one of the figures that you shared with me the other day is that, we've got investor locations, as you've put it down, and 9%, and this is Queensland government, 9% of our investors are in Asia, 5% are in Europe, 2% are in the USA, and then the rest, which 83%, is in Australia. Let's talk a bit more about that. I mean, what sort of investment should we be looking at as a nation that is quite, we're not hugely populated. We don't have a huge number of wealthy people in the country, to invest. But let's just talk a bit about that. That 83%, what are we largely looking at in Australian investment?
Well, essentially, the thing I sent you was where the Treasury's latest issues have gone to, the Queensland Treasury in particular. So, most of the Commonwealth debt and state debt are very different, because the Commonwealth debt is used, the bonds that they issue, it's used in different ways. So essentially, the Commonwealth, once it issues security, so it issues a bond. In other words, that's how it borrows money, and it issues it into the capital markets. People buy those bonds, and essentially some of them are zero coupon, but by a coupon you get a fixed amount of money every year, which is a proportion, your bond yield on that particular whatever value it is.
How do we put that in layman's terms quickly for people out there?
Yeah, well, essentially how it works, they call it a coupon, because when you go to universities and you see when people are selling things and they pull off the a bottom, with the phone number, and they'll pull it off, and eventually all those coupons go with that phone number. It works the same way, whereas they used to have to, once you've got a bond, so you've got a certificate, and essentially you'll have to just take a coupon in, and then they pay you. It obviously all works electronic now, but we still keep all of the old tech terminology.
Language,
But they're used in a couple of ways. So they obviously raise money for the government. Bonds are a longer term instrument, so longer than 12 months maturity. Anything under 12 months that they issue are notes that essentially are in the money markets. So they don't have any coupons attached to them. but the longer term ones they do for longer term debt and major infrastructure and to pay continue to roll over the debt. They can go to banks all over the world. They're much more marketable than state debt is. So a lot easier to sell.
We lost our AAA credit rating a few years ago, didn't we?
We did around the GFC. So the impacts of that. So our budget obviously struggled a bit through that period. So it's New South Wales and Victoria are the only two states that have retained their AAA. But a lot of that's to do with their
there's
size
some bad news
well.
too. It looks like the Cowboys lost tonight. One of our Kevin Barry, thank you. He's just posted the Cowboys loss. I hope it wasn't a bad loss. But yeah, sorry to interrupt.
No,
Keep going.
The other special thing about what they use the Commonwealth government bonds for is when the Reserve Bank conducts open market operations. So that's how it goes in and then purchases these out of the market. When it does that, it credits whatever bank has initially bought or is holding that bond. The Reserve Bank buys it off them, and then it credits their exchange accounts with cash. So that actually pumps money into the economy for banks to be able to lend more. And when they do that when they're trying to reduce interest rates, because then there's more money in the system and it's cheaper for banks to lend to one another. And similarly, if they want to put in up interest rates and increase them, then they'll essentially sell them, and take money out of the economy.
In the obviously with this COVID stuff, there's been talk of negative interest rates. Do you think Australia will see that?
Well, it's the Reserve Bank governor doesn't seem to feel that that's the way to go, but we have seen that all over the world. And obviously the negative interest rates is essentially the banks are charging you to hold your money. And you'll see.
That sounds crazy, doesn't it?
It does.
Like if you've got $1 million in the bank, they're going to charge you 0.25 actually to have it there.
Yeah,
that's
certainly.
How it works, yeah.
Yep.
Pays to be poor, eh?
Definitely. Well, it's I mean, where interest rates go, it's the official government rates and that. Obviously, they filter on into other loan interest rates as well. So they'll be sort of controlling that. I think something that they'll probably do before they move to that, because at the moment we've already got very low interest rates, which is even though it's good for people who want to go and buy a house, but you've got a lot of retirees and savers that depend on that money, and that's a lot of that's when you decrease interest rates so low for those savers, because they spend quite a bit of their money that they have. So when they're getting such low interest rates, their earnings are down. That affects consumer spending as well in the economy.
Yeah.
So it's a sort of interest rates coming down is not always
good, particularly the self-funded retirees. Look, let's just talk a bit about the Queensland government debt. I often read in the media it's a ballooning debt. How are we going to recover? This debt's just getting worse. I mean, what's your perspective on the Queensland government's debt and in terms of recovery as well?
It's about $95 billion currently. Is that right?
Well, the last estimates, over the estimates to 23, it was 83 billion in the, but then it was updated to 91 billion by the treasurer the other day. It was 83 in the to 2023 in the estimates. So when they did the estimates for the budget, they do over a few years, and it has ballooned since then. It has got worse. And this year it's going to be obviously with the 4 billion that they've had to spend that they didn't plan on spending before. It's obviously going to increase, and it's very likely to be over 100 billion. Obviously we don't know until until that time comes and
well,
the budget's going to
we've
get
got a
pushed up.
question from one of our viewers. It's from Cal Bunyan. He's saying, how can Queensland clear the 95 billion debt without turning the lights off?
Well, you could either grow the economy or significantly, but still it's going to take a long time to do that. Or another option is to sell assets, as Victoria and New South Wales have done, to bring their debt down.
Do we even have any left?
Well, strange enough, most of the assets that were sold, in Queensland assets, happened in the Beattie and Bligh years. So, it was a thing about whether, with Campbell Newman, whether he was going to sell, some of the ports and some of those assets. But
well, it's
is it possible to trim back our public service? I think some of the figures that, again, I read on our expenses, employee expenses in the public service, like, $25,728 million per annum, or projected 2021. That's a lot of money.
Yeah, it's 25 billion. So it's about 40% of the Queensland government's revenues that go out in expenses to about 230,000 of Queensland's public servants. Yeah, so essentially, we're always talking about that.
So 40% of the money goes to 25% of the people.
Yeah. Yeah, well, they're about 10% of total employment in Queensland, which is about 2.5 million people. So, put it in perspective, it's becomes an issue because when you look at where the revenues for the Queensland government come from, 46% are coming from GST redistributions from the Commonwealth. Yeah. So its own generation of its own source revenue, is only sitting around about 35 billion. So, when almost 25 billion is going to public services, there's not a lot left there to spend anything else on.
The full-time equivalent, I need to make a point too, Brendan, the full-time equivalent public servants, I think there's 230,000 roughly. Yeah. I think it's nearly 40% live in Brisbane in the CBD. 40% of that number, yep. So a lot of our money is going to the Brisbane CBD, if you like, another way of looking at it. And just to mention also, before you ask your question, Brendan, Juju Anderson, who's posted, has said no selling assets. Haven't we learnt from previous actions? And she says we need money spent on money-making projects. That's how you get cash into the economy, not building a walking bridge over the Brisbane River.
There it is, or a rail line from South
Cross River Rail. Yeah.
So being an economist, when you see those sort of projects, when they talk about Cross River Rail and all that sort of stuff, knowing that the debt clock for Queensland's just climbing up and ballooning up, and knowing all those things that you do, is it, from your point of view, and obviously it's not a political question, but from an economist's question, do you just shake your head and think, wow, this is...
Are we spending wisely? Is that smart spending?
Are we serious? Or is it a very concerning thing from someone who looks at numbers all day, or is it...
Well, certainly it's got to have a bang for a buck, exactly as your Liz has said. If you're going to borrow money, you have to spend it on productive assets. It's going maybe be a benefit. The 4 billion, 5 billion going into Cross River Rail. Well, obviously before the costs blow out, they always do. But essentially we need dams. We can't have a state running out of water. We're a farm and quarry economy. Agriculture makes up 10% of our businesses. It's our beef industry is our third biggest export after coal, which makes up about 40% of our state's exports. And then you've got LNG, which has been growing very quickly. Those exports out of Gladstone, growing
sugar
quite phenomenally. Yeah, sugar as well.
Nice.
So I spent a little over 2 years working with the sugar industry, with the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries up in Townsville. I know how integral and important sugar is to a lot of the coastal regions up in North Queensland in particular. So these are very important, and fruit and vegetables and fruit and nuts and vegetables. Those exports are obviously quite lucrative for us too. So essentially, I think we should be looking. I know we've spoken to Uninet about the getting the Bradfield scheme going.
Yes.
I'm a big supporter of that.
Yeah.
Because I met with Salio Helscher. We actually met with him and discussed it, and it was very interesting. He was probably he's definitely one of the best public servants we've had in the state. He was explaining to me how he started when he was at Treasury, how he started the coal industry and the aluminium industries in Queensland. We really haven't. Well, the LNG industry got going, which is great, but we really need to start developing these industries and getting that infrastructure built. Those royalties and those export revenues will drive our growth. We're an exporting state and exporting country, and
that's right.
And
so much. I always say it again and again. So much untapped potential. In terms of the number of those industries you've mentioned. I mean, my research also tells me that 80% of our exports, Queensland's exports in the last 12 months to April, come from the resource sector, even though coal still is the largest exporter, and there was a drop of about 8.8%. Our minerals are up 7%, but our total, resource sector is just, I believe it will save Queensland, and it'll be, but if we can embrace our agricultural or aquaculture and other industries, that really are probably not as big as they could be. Not, they don't have the life in them yet, because we need things like another dam. We need the Bradfield scheme happening. I mean, perhaps I'll even go so far as we need to build Hell's Gate Dam as a starting point, and the true vision for Hell's Gate, not a watered down, smaller version. Not only will Hell's Gate Dam, from what I understand, the true vision of it is not only will it create 20,000 permanent jobs, not just and that's permanent jobs afterwards because of the spin-off, the meat processing, and that's not to, and it's also a bit of hydro on there, and we can totally bring down, a lot of the price of a lot of stuff in processing. But you must be, as an economist too, the attention given to Copper Stream 2.0 and the I think it was 2.4 million that the Queensland government did allocate to get the ball rolling a bit more on Copper Stream. That's got to be a good thing, because opening the minerals sector further out to Mount Isa will help.
Oh, certainly, and and all the kerfuffle about the Galilee, and Adani in particular. I mean, that's a massive province, and the government it was on the state development map until all of this sort of the kerfuffle and shenanigans went on. But I mean, there's a massive province there to open up. That they're building new coal mines. They're looking at building them more in the Bowen Basin as well, and you've got Ackland trying to open up down in the Downs, and having trouble getting the approval processes through and everything. I mean, the government it needs to get out of the way and reduce this regulation so we can get the state moving. And it's more important than ever now, because that budget of 60 billion, it's not going to be anywhere near 60 billion with all the closures. Police weren't taking fines. Their stamp duties are down. All of these things would have been down. Luckily, the royalties, as you said, have held up pretty well. We're still, we're still at about 81 billion over the year. When I looked at the last merchandise exports for Queensland last week, it has held up, as you said, and it's a very important industry, and it should be supported.
Yeah,
well, it's funny you talk about the Adani thing, and whether you're for or against it. The thing that probably people laugh about, especially in the coal industry, is they said, the best thing about Adani is it takes the heat off all the other ones. There's it's quite a small, that, like, this is what they say, it's quite a small mine compared to the other ones that are opening up. And
Well, I think there's about 6 mines in the Galilee Basin that want to go ahead.
Yep.
Not just
I think
Adani, Carmichael.
I think there's
7. Okay.
Yeah, there's 7.
Yeah, last time I looked.
The Carmichael one's one of the smallest ones, and
yeah,
so
that's right.
It's quite interesting. Gina Reinhardt's got a few. I think Clive Palmer's got 3.
Clive's got one out there. Yeah.
So yeah, no, it is quite interesting. And the other thing I'll make, you talk about 20,000 jobs. It's the thing that always seems that especially this government, it's never about the next thing. Like it's like they're just playing what's in front of them as opposed to actually planning. And so the thing that's really disappointing when you talk about things like Hell's Gate and that, like I've talked to one of the engineers who was helping design it or be a part of it. He said, even if we started tomorrow, it'd be 15 years before we actually put water in it.
That's
so
right.
15 years. The thing I always say is, gee, we got to wait a long time in this country to do things. Like if that was, and again, we don't want to be like China. We're not saying let's just throw the rule book out and off we go. But and this is on the extreme thing. But when they did the Yangtze River, the authorities walked through the main street of one of the towns on the Yangtze River and said, "Oh, hey guys, in 30 days' time, there's going to be a wall of water coming, so he's got to leave the town." That's how they do it. Obviously, we don't want to do that. We can't do that. But it just shows you, like, when they actually want to do something, that's how they do it. Whereas in Australia, we take 15 years before we're going to get water in a dam that potentially could give us 20,000 jobs. And you can see the difference in, of why our country, doesn't seem to have that can-do attitude anymore. Without taking Campbell Newman's slogan, but you'd nearly call this current Labor government the can't do government because they just can't do anything. And it's, for all those people out there, it's just embarrassing, to say, oh no, we can't open this and we can't, it's just constant can'ts. And it's just so frustrating.
What I found really good, Brendan, is that a couple of the MPs that we have had on the show in past interviews, we've asked them about what they would do if they were, Premier for 7 days. Where would they start? And, I quite liked Stephen, I think it was Stephen Andrew. His response was, or was it Nick Demeter? I can't remember. But one of them said, look, we'd look at what we can do. What can we do right now? What's blocking what people are saying we can't do? Let's have a look and just give something a go that might really make a huge difference. And I think, it's easy to find reasons for why we can't do this, why we can't do that. But when it comes to nation building projects, taking a very well calculated, educated, particularly with proposals like the Bradfield scheme, or at least Hell's Gate Dam, which is, part of it in the starting point. There's so many studies that have been done, so many over and over. I mean, if we did a survey, I am sure that we would get more than 60, 70, 80% of people saying, let's go for it. Let's do this.
Well, I think there's a few things to talk about there. I think there's been $100 million spent on feasibility studies for dams. And Barnaby Joyce was in control of it, like that was his portfolio, and they spent $100 million on feasibility studies.
Yeah,
and that's and they're meant to be for the bush, and that's the thing that probably gets disappointing. The other thing I'll say is, I seen in the news this week that Urena Dam, they're potentially 12 months away from getting a start. Now, we've got elections coming up, so you sort of can't take people's word for what's going to happen. It's always, the last election, within 3 months we'll have the Urena Dam started, and here we are. It's been another year, and now they're saying, oh no, another 12 months, and it's just that constant. They constantly put that goalpost a little bit further.
Another example of that is that the dual Horton pipeline here in Townsville. We're still waiting for stage 2 money from the federal government. Yes, it's happening. Well, how long does it bloody will take?
Takes a long time.
But let's look in the defense of our current government. They did produce a document that I've read, and I'm sure lots of people have read. It's called the 15-point action plan, and for recovery, for how we're going to move out of and get this economy going again. And I'd love your thoughts on this action plan, Marcus. If there's a focus on tax There's a focus on road and rail. There's a focus on the hospitality industry and mining industries in the regions. I'm quite interested, in mining, that the Queensland government is talking about fast-tracking decisions for Queensland mining projects, and for road and rail bringing forward projects to generate employment opportunities. I mean, there's a lot of, literature and advertising paraphernalia, but what are your thoughts on this?
As in the plan in general, with all of its facets. Well, obviously the $50 billion, the sort of the guarantee to get those infrastructure productive assets, get that money out there and get those projects started. That's great, but as you sort of mentioned before, we just it just gets announced and announced and announced, and then how long does it take to turn the dirt? There's sort of my concerns, and as you said, we've had a problem with getting things going, as you did mention, over the last few years. Well, it has been a while, and it's been a long time since we built a dam, as you know.
Very long time.
So, well, we've got the one at Bundaberg, which is maybe need to be replaced.
Paradise, is it? Paradise.
Yeah, Paradise. It's Can
you believe that there's a government when 85% of Queensland's in a drought, we're going to actually tear a dam down?
Yeah,
that's embarrassing. I'm honestly embarrassed.
Or bring the wall down. Because I spoke with the Bundy, and they're looking. They're a great food bowl there, and they're looking to expand their their agricultural industry significantly. But you can't do that without water security. So I mean, the other things with that. Well, we had the 100,000. The 100 million in adaptation grants. So that's reached about 10,000 sort of businesses. I mean, the issue with that is it's it's got to be to be able to sustain, and you've got to come up with the receipts for what you're going to spend it on and everything. Whereas the other states just gave businesses $10,000 each. So the other governments. So it's you had the you had the 50 billion allocated for the other initial loans. That only reached 10,000 businesses, because we've got 457,000 businesses in the state. And although 65% of those are sole operators, I mean, they haven't really seen anything except for a few bucks thrown on them to assist them with electricity. They haven't really seen anything out of it. So, well, it was 50 billion, but they only thought it was only going to reach about 6,000 then, so they threw in another 50. So it ended up being 100 billion, and it got about 10,000 businesses for those loans. So. I mean, there were issues with that, obviously, with it not being large enough. You can't give, every business a loan, otherwise it would cost them too much money. But, first in, best dressed isn't sort of a great policy to do it either. It should have targeted those businesses. A lot of businesses that got those grants were still operating. I know some of them that were still doing well.
And that's the thing. A lot of the times, the ones who are organised, who potentially are better at business, will be organised enough to go in and make sure that their accountant got that, or made sure that they applied for it, and they're organised. And that's when you probably get handouts, generally it's probably to the ones that are suffering, and that's a real general comment. That's not having to go at anyone that suffered or anything, but that's a lot. That's probably out of this. That's what'll happen. Like, you'll actually see the ones that, and like you said, that are doing well, they'll get the handout, and they'll go, oh, how good was that? But there'll be a lot that'll miss the mark. Or, it's a constant thing on Facebook now. To see a business after 25 years we're closing up because we couldn't survive COVID. And that's very disappointing, I think.
No, I think we're going to see a lot of that. So
I want to go back to the economic recovery plan too in the government. Let's talk about tax now, Marcus. If you were on the team, and they're talking, part of this action plan is to review taxation, state taxation. So looking at things like, stamp duty, payroll tax or registration, other taxes, property taxes, for motor dealers and hospitality, etc. If you were on a team reviewing that, what would you think would be a good way forward in terms of changes, or at least changes that will help as part of the recovery?
Yeah, like what in the taxing system kickstarts it? Like, is it getting rid of payroll tax? Is it getting like what tax reform would you see to kickstart the economy?
Yeah.
Well, I worked and did some modelling and got for the Under Treasurer to get that latest payroll tax reduction. So there was you got a 1% in the regional regions, and the threshold was lifted from 1.1 million to 1.3 in payroll. The thing you the thing you've got to with payroll tax is Queensland is a small business state, and most of the business don't go anywhere near $1 million in payrolls a year. So it only really touches larger employers, but you really have to have over 20 full-time employees to even be, which are so you're going to need revenues probably of 2 million plus if you're running over 1.1 million in labor costs. But it's only a small amount of businesses that it actually hits. So although it was a good thing we sort of got that through, the 1% reduction was also good, as I mentioned, for regions outside of SEQ. But the other thing was Toowoomba got, because of the cities deal, got bought into the SEQ, so they didn't benefit from that. So obviously, when I go out to Toowoomba, they consider themselves a regional community and not part of the SEQ, so they weren't very happy about that at all. But things like, well, there's land tax as well. It's not a big money maker. So payroll tax is about 4.7 billion, I think, a year that they generate from that. But it is it's a tax. It's an insidious tax on employment. So it's it's one of those nuisance, one of those bad taxes.
To me, it's a pointless tax. Like you're like, oh, I want to try and employ more people. Okay, well, you got to pass the tax. You got to pay. You actually got to pay the government to get someone to come and work for you to try and grow the economy.
Yeah.
It's the dumbest. Is it not the dumbest tax that we have?
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is the sort of thing I think they're going to, look at it more broadly, because it can't just be a state thing, because it needs to go sort of wider than that. And I think I spoke to Nanette about the way that the GST redistributions are allocated to the states. I think we really need to have a look at that, because it's since it was first brought in, it hasn't really been reviewed or modified since. And there's a lot of issues with some states receiving, like ACT, which has the highest income per capita in the country, an average of a significantly higher average income, and they receive actual redistributions from the other states. They're a positive from what tax GST is paid. They receive a lot more back than what they pay in.
You'll probably start another riot.
Yeah, well, WA was obviously
they get shafted the most. WA, don't they?
Well, definitely, because all the royalties. Yeah,
what do they get? 50? Is it 58 cents?
Yeah, well, it's I haven't seen the most recent, because they actually had a win and
they got an extra 3 cents or something.
Yeah, something like that. But
because correct me if I'm wrong, WA gets hit the worst.
Yep.
Well, they're the least. Queensland.
Yeah, Queensland was still a net beneficiary, actually. So it's
I thought
only marginally though. But essentially it's Queensland, New South Wales and Victoria that get hammered. And it's sort of.
But in saying that though, they've probably only got you know, a few thousand k's of roads to look after, so it's probably not that too bad. But when you look at WA and Queensland, like their vast land, you know, the cost
big distances.
Yeah, it's massive, and even Northern Territory with what have they got, 250,000 people?
Yeah,
you know, there's no way that they'd be able to pay their own way, I guess.
Yep.
No.
And this is the whole thing about it, because it's supposed to be it's a very complicated formula. It's more like psychotherapy than it is, you know, a financial economic model. You know, the factors that go in there, like it's needs based. How do you define need? You know, and essentially, well, believe it or not, the size of your public service is actually the indication that they use as to, you know, how much need you have to service. So there's a perverse incentive to grow your state's public service.
Oh, wow.
To receive
Okay.
More government.
Okay, now it makes sense.
We call it the flypaper effect. Yeah. So it's one of those perverse incentives. So it should be aimed at growing.
There'll be viewers out there that are just shaking their head at that. Yeah. So just reiterate that. Say that again uninterrupted, because we should actually put this out there really well.
Yeah. No, So the size of your public services, it provides them with an indication of obviously state need, and you know that gets built into the formula, and other sort of subjective things as well. But predominantly, I think it should be geared towards, you know, you shouldn't be taking wealth from the areas that you know, that are generating it and then redistributing it to the ones that aren't. I mean, it's supposed to be on a horizontal fiscal equalization, because essentially, you know, it's to ensure that Australians across the whole country, you know, are treated equitably. And you know,
actually, one of our viewers, Raj Patel, actually wants to know a bit more about horizontal fiscal equalization. So, nice.
Yeah, it comes about because it's very important, because we've got a vertical fiscal imbalance, which is essentially, you know, with the Second World War, the federal government took control of the income taxes away from the states. So it essentially then it takes all the tax, well, predominantly most of the taxation revenue in the country, but it's not responsible for any of the services that it provides. So when they do that, then obviously they have the, especially through the GST redistributions, they have the system to then be able to distribute it back to the states, what they generate. So, and they try and do it on the basis that people across all of Australia have the same social opportunities, and you know, to be able to you know, to be able to operate and function, you know, at the same living standards.
I struggle with that. I struggle with that. That's how they think when you can't even actually birth a child in somewhere like Bowen.
Yeah, that's right.
You know, like you know, people love going to Bowen for holiday.
No, maternity hospitals.
If you're a woman just about to give birth, get out of Bowen, because you can't have a kid there. You got to go to, I think, Proserpine or Ayr. You know, like it just anyway, blows my mind.
Yeah, so that's administered by the Commonwealth Grants Commission. You know, and as the point I was sort of making is, you know, Queensland and WA are where we really should be focused on, you know, and Northern Territory to a degree, and you know, getting our resource sector and developing these areas, you know, so that we can grow the pie. You know, you don't take money out of those areas when that's where your growth, the opportunity for growth is, and then give it down to, you know, South Australia or Tasmania. You know, when it could be better spent, invested up in the resource states. So I mean, there's a whole thing. I think I sent you a lot of the points about the problems with the system, but I mean, taxation is just one of those things. We had the Henry Review, and you know, I think what was it, about 4 out of the 100 recommendations got implemented. Taxation is one of those things that's really hard to do. So you know, it's yeah, it's a complex area, and and it's what's going to have the biggest bang for buck. We obviously.
Do you think people in regional areas should have better tax incentives than those living in cities?
Well, that brings up a whole sort of range of things. We should be encouraging people to go to move to the regions. I certainly am for that, and especially because it's the cost of electricity, and especially in is a big issue for I know for North Queensland. I see it in all of, especially for their businesses. I see that in my pulse survey that I was doing from every quarter from 2018 to the last one in March this year, and it's just a problem particularly for those outside of SEQ. So you're always raising those issues, and and obviously I put it out there in the report. It's one of those things, and we continue to talk about it, how we're gonna solve it, what we're gonna do about it, but. Getting back to taxation, I mean, it's what sort of options do when we get to the state government? Their revenue is going to be so it's going to be absolutely wiped out from this COVID, and unless they're going to put cuts to the public service or reduce their expenses. It's hard to argue for reductions in tax.
Well, let's talk a bit more about the central North Queensland economy, and as a consequence of a lot of the stuff you've just said, how are we going to fare, do you think, going forward? What do you forecast?
Well, I've seen a lot of forecasts. I work very closely with a good friend and colleague in Cairns, Pete Faulkner from Conus Consulting. So he looks very closely at the regional unemployment data and the ABS series at that regional level across Queensland. And so I each month I get to see what's happening across all the different indicators, and also within each of the industries, which is done on a quarterly basis. He's done a little bit of forecasting with respect to across all of the different regions. And it's going to be, I mean, obviously those that are most exposed to tourism are going to get, are going to feel it the most. Yeah. Like Gold Coast he's forecast somewhere around about 16% unemployment. This is on a trend basis. So, Toowoomba actually fared the worst from the April data on an original basis.
Was there any places that actually increased?
No, definitely not.
Like there was there was no like, oh, what were they doing sort of thing. Like was no. Or who was the least?
Well, we lost about 135,000 jobs on a trend basis from March to April.
Which region had the least amount of loss?
Oh, I've got that here.
Can't remember. No.
Oh, I've got it in front of me. That was Queensland Outback, but you remember there's only a small amount of people out there. So, but Toowoomba had about 2,000, Darling Downs about 4.5, Mackay about 5. Across all of the Brisbane regions, and Central Queensland lost about 5,700, Cairns 6,300, Townsville 6,700. But the ones that got hit the hardest coming into Gold Coast lost 19,000, Brisbane South almost 11, Sunshine Coast almost 11, Brisbane Inner City lost 10, and Ipswich 8.5. You're starting to move down further.
And probably just to confirm stuff, none of them were public servants.
No.
Well, no. So, yeah, probably a lot of cafe shop and operators and staff and things like that. I'd imagine. Because like Brisbane's got has got a lot of tourism as well, but it's not so concentrated as what the other regions are. So yeah, so Gold Coast is forecast to be pretty bad on the unemployment projections.
Hence, Cross River Rail project. They got to get a job.
Yeah. Well,
new jobs,
construction,
couple of hundred going. Yeah.
So by June, the forecasts there are predominantly Douglas up and around the Cairns region. There is going to be bad, over 20%. It's going to be Mackay about 11 too.
Wow.
But this is the thing: the mining and resource sector's been pretty, less exposed. If anything, especially when you look at the trade numbers. It's held up extremely well. So
it's held up extremely well, and having been out here, any of the, I guess, the downgrading of it has purely been around the safety side of it. So it's been, like offices have had to, shrink them down because of actually the regulation behind it, or the law, not having so many people in offices and all that sort of stuff. So it'd be interesting to see the rebound. Like once the laws are lifted, like I think it'll snap straight back. I think it'll move back a lot quicker than anything else.
But there are some, I think Glencore, there's some mines that are forcing short shutdowns. There is a bit of that happening. People are having to take a couple of weeks leave. I'm aware of that. But that might have to do with sales of coal, I guess, export. And who knows what's happening with China and our trade relations at the moment. I mean, so there's a sort of roll-on effect of that sort of stuff. And but there is some forced shutdowns, as they call it, going on or going to be happening. Yeah.
There's also I mean, Cairns is going to get hit fairly hard as well. It's about 14%.
What's Townsville's forecast?
Not too bad, about 8. So we're going to fare fairly well considering.
Well, I think it was September 2019. It was 8.9% unemployment.
Yep.
Our youth unemployment is probably the worry. It was at 17.3 last September. So
no, that's an issue across everywhere. So a major problem. I don't know if I have done breakdowns in this one here, but maybe I have.
So that's actually promising for Townsville. Cairns is not so promising. Obviously, the tourism category perhaps has an implication there.
Especially the Asian market coming in, I think would be
and Mackay said too, didn't you?
Yep.
Was
gonna fare well too, but it's very volatile there. It's
in terms of the markets moving forward. Like obviously you've seen some heavy gains, especially in the US market. Obviously, and you've got two sides of politics over there. One trying to bash it down because they want to win an election at the end of the year, and you got the other side bashing it up, saying no, we're going to recover quite quickly. From an economist's point of view, what's your gut feeling, and what is it looking like? Do you think we're going to recover better than expected, or is it going to be that depression that the left side of politics is hoping for over in America?
I don't think we're going to bounce straight. I don't think it's going to be a V recovery, as I sort of talk about. I think predominantly this has been sort of different to the GFC. GFC was a financial crisis that caused an economic problem, an economic crisis. This has been an economic crisis, which could potentially turn into a financial crisis. And with the amount of debt now, the mortgage stress, and that we're already seeing, if to think we're going to just sort of bounce out of this, I'm not convinced that that's sort of going to be the case. I think there's a lot of businesses that probably won't bother opening, and it's a real problem because if that happens, and a lot of the unemployment's obviously being held down at the moment with respect to the job keeper programs. If that once that winds up in September, I mean, we could have a lot of zombie workers essentially walking around now that once that tap's turned off, the businesses won't be able to afford to sort of put them back on. I mean, you're looking at gyms and that, like a lot of them have completely lost most of their members. Are people just going to come back and jump back in? Businesses like that. So, retail trade figures, I've seen a lot of figures thrown around about how much it's costing the economy and that, and I think some of them are fairly, pretty fantastic. But I looked at the April from March to April. Well, you can't use March because you had the panic buying. But if you look at essentially the February figure, which was before that big spike from the panic buying, and compare April to it, we're probably around about 500 million down. So, essentially it might only be one over the June quarter, 1.5 billion reduction. And most of that's in obviously accommodation in the hospitality accommodation and in your restaurants and cafes, etc. They've really been hit the hardest, but also clothing and footwear got hit pretty hard as well. So how these businesses are going to bounce back out of this? I mean,
do you think manufacturing, especially with the whole buying Australian, everyone sort of realised through the COVID thing that maybe kickstarting manufacturing back in Australia. Do you think maybe that's also something that'll help us sort of come out the other side of this, or do you think people will actually struggle? Businesses will actually struggle to get the money to actually fund that sort of stuff.
Well, I think the issue with manufacturing is it's too expensive and too difficult to do business these days. We've got the highest real minimum wage in the world. It bounces up and down with Norway, but 1 and 2. But essentially, it's very expensive relative here to manufacture here. So. As you said, unless Australians start to focus on that sort of advanced stuff and more niche sort of manufacturing, whether we can go back to, we're not going to be able to compete with Korea and China and these countries. But I mean, there is that argument to the self-reliance, so that we're not sort of where we have been, where with the borders shut and things having trouble, retailers having trouble.
We need to get a better balance with that sort of stuff.
Definitely, but you have to address those underlying energy costs in particular if you're going to get manufacturing going, because it's the right time, because our manufacturing and agriculture sector has shrunk significantly once the dollar essentially went to $1.10. So it just made us completely uncompetitive. As an exporter of manufacturing products, but that's come down now to about 65 cents. So, there's some thoughts.
And I'll see what you think here. There's thoughts that the Australian dollar's been propped up for far too long, and it should really be down around 40 cents. Do you agree with that, or do you?
It's it's having a low dollar. It's it's around about where it's been on sort of average. It has been lower in about 55 and that, but it's.
Do you think it's been propped up?
Well, there's a couple that there's many things that affect the dollar. It's foreign investment to bring money in, because obviously when foreigners not just when they purchase their goods, but when they invest in our put deposits in our banks, they have to change their money for Australian dollars to do it, and buy us financial securities. They'll essentially have to exchange their money to buy the Australian dollar, which puts pressure on it to go up. So there's all these factors that feed into that. Whether it's being propped up, it's really a sign. Well, can you really control it with interest rates anymore? Because it's also factors in what makes us an attractive investment for them to hold their financial assets. Is what the interest rate is on the holding the dollar. So obviously interest rates are right down now. There's not far to go, and essentially where it is now, because the RBA essentially they pay 25 basis points to banks to hold money in those accounts. So there's very little for them to actually go. So
I have a question here from a viewer. I'll just interject. The federal government has announced a further investment allowance post-June. Will this keep the cash flow going in the country?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the federal government have really, well, it's everyone's sort of done a good job to get things going. But I mean, the federal government have really done a lot of the heavy lifting here. And when I worked very closely with ACCI when I was at CCIQ, the Australian Chamber of Commerce, and they've got a direct ear with this government in particular. They're very focused on business and assisting particularly small business. So they're very receptive, and we help to bring across a lot of the issues that our members were bringing up with us, and some of the problems with the initial, the initial things that were announced and released, like JobKeeper, with respect to employers were expected to pay the $1,500 for each employee to the employees before they actually received the money from the government, like things like that. There were sort of teething problems with all of that, but essentially they moved to get that ready. I think we're going to need something new. We're going to have to leave the tap on. I don't think it's not good, obviously, to leave it on for long term. We'll have to sort of play it by ear to how things go, and I'm sure they will be receptive to, if things don't sort of improve, to provide that stimulus and support to the economy. I think government measures will only go so far, and the longer, the longer we're closed, and the damage, it's it's going to make it more difficult, and because economies just don't sort of bounce back. You get a hysteresis effect, which means they don't just, once something happens, it's not like a spring where it just bounces back. It's sort of very, becomes flaccid.
Gradual.
I've
got another question, and this might actually interest some of our viewers. What would your advice be to self-funded retirees in terms of what they should do with their money right now in this current climate?
I'm not a financial, I can't provide any financial advice, but I mean, it is difficult. I think you have to sort of assess the risks. So I sort of probably didn't get to the point where, about what's happening with international markets. We were talking about those earlier, and with the US and how things are going to prop up there. They're printing an enormous amount of money. And if you look at the share market and compare it to earnings, it's very hard to justify where some of those values are, but in that stock market. But that's what's happening. It's the same with Australia here to the property market too. There's not a lot of consumer consumption. Most of the money goes into housing, and over there, it's most of their money goes into the stock markets. So whether we're going to see any sort of stress in the financial markets, I mean, that could really unwind, because the amount of debt that's been issued and bought back by the Federal Reserve is phenomenal.
I read the other day, and you might be able to shed some more light on this, that the US government was buying a lot of gold. And talking about trying to put their currency back onto the gold thing. Is the gold?
The gold standard.
Yeah. Is there any truth in that? And is that a way out of trying to get themselves out of debt? Is that? I sort of don't understand it.
Yeah, well, essentially how the gold standard worked is after World War II, we had to obviously rebuild it. So we had to come up with a way to, there was original gold standard, and then there's a Bretton Woods system, which was the more modern gold standard, where the US dollar was the main currency, because the whole world was flattened after the Second World War, and we had to sort of I think the US had 75% of the world's assets, and so they were in a position where so this is the thing, they had all the currencies all controlled, and they did that by pegging the US dollar to gold, and then all of the other currencies pegged theirs to the US. So our economy actually benefited when we were one of the first to leave that system. leave the Bretton Woods system, and that's sort of how we floated the currency, and how we did very well with our exports, and we once we saw the economy open up, it was one of those, we did very well in those years. Whether we can return to something like that again, it's the other problem is we had the Asian crisis, and that was really caused sort of by that, because once the Asian economies, the developing ones, once their currency was under pressure to depreciate, they had to go in and buy their own currency. And to do that, to buy your own currency, you can't buy it with your own currency. You have to either buy it with foreign currency, or you buy it with gold.
Okay.
So essentially, they depleted all of their foreign exchange reserves as well as their gold. So they had nothing left to defend their currencies. So, they eventually had to depreciate. So whether those systems can actually work, it's, I think it's a thing sort of for the times. But I don't think it's a time just yet to do that. And it was undermined as well, the gold price in particular through the London market. So whether something like that could actually operate in today's world, I'm not really sure.
One of our viewers has just asked what years were you just referring to? What era?
For the Bretton Woods system.
Yeah.
It was after the Second World War.
It's World War II, yeah.
Yeah, okay. World War II. And essentially we left it around about, we floated our currency in, what was it, 81 or 83? So we were one of the first to do it. But the Asian, economies, as I mentioned, had a bad time with being forced to abandon it, the peg. Okay. So,
yeah.
Right. Just two other questions probably about that sort of stuff. Obviously, new technology, like with blockchain coming out. They're talking that's probably, you got Facebook coming out saying that they're going to make their own currency. This digital currency, is that? Do you see that as a good thing or a bad thing? Yeah, obviously you've seen a big rise in them, but to actually have, Facebook come out and say that they're going to make their own currency, talking about blockchain. Is that something that you're looking at with interest, or do you think it's a waste of time, or what's the feeling out there?
Well, it comes down to what it's backed by, and this is a problem with the cryptos and why I wouldn't use them. It's not backed by anything. I mean, when you've got a debt from a government or a bank, you've got a receipt. You've actually got something to that's actually backing it. But for it just to be out in the cloud and have no recourse if the system collapses, I'd be very careful with that. You saw the rise and then the great fall, but Facebook, I don't know, are they going to are they going to guarantee it by their shares? I haven't read into
I only just seen it the other day. I only just seen it the other day, but it'll be interesting to see what.
Interesting times. All right. Well, I think we're close. I'm just conscious of time. I think we're pretty close to the end of this interview. But as we allow, we'd invite all our featured guests. It's an opportunity for you to, share whatever you think might be good to share with the viewers about, could be about what we're going through right now or anything really to do with our economy.
Yeah, no, well, it's things are tough at the moment. So, everyone stays safe. The issue now is when we're ready to open the borders. And my personal views is I think before maybe around the school holidays, so we can get some visitors in. Particularly from interstate, but that's an issue, and there's a lot of it. I know it's a big issue up there too, where there haven't been many cases to open, and totally support that as well. And I think the quicker we can get into sort of opening up the economy, and obviously I think everyone's got a little bit more awareness now, and hopefully a bit of common sense anyway around social distancing, and I think we've learnt We're not children. We can be consenting adults, and I think it's time for the government to step back. But obviously we'll see how that evolves. But I'm very interested I'm passionate, obviously, about the particularly for NQ, for the Bradfield, as well as getting the Galilee going. So I've in particular, I did a few articles which went in the Australian supporting Adani in particular, and how it would benefit the north, and in particular, Townsville and Mackay and Rockhampton regions. So so it's great that that's going ahead, and I really hope that we can start to get things going, and as we keep talking about developing Northern Australia, actually get down to doing it.
We didn't get a chance to ask you, but what is your position on the creation of the seventh state of Australia, Central North Queensland becoming the seventh state of Australia down the track?
Well, we had to have those discussions ourselves. I think the issues will be around as a sort of. I don't know when we're reaching as a state. I mean, we're trying to save the ones we've got at the moment. It's to be able to split it. It's going to be such an enormous change. And when you've got $100 billion of debt, you've got councils that are already, most of them, in financial strife. Whether how they're going to redistribute that debt, because you can't just leave it down there and just open up your own state.
See you later.
Have to be redistributed. See you later. Good luck.
Bad divorce.
Bad divorce.
They made. I say they made the debt so they can keep it.
I'm not sure it'll float with them though. So I mean, they're the real issues, and you've only got about 1 million people. Yeah.
Just on that, people go, "Oh, how much is it going to cost us?" My only statement back to that is, how much is it going to cost us not to do it? That's so.
Yeah. I think eventually, and obviously when I lived in there, and I'm from Townsville, and it's sort of a no-brainer when you're up there. But when you're sort of looking at, there are, how you're going to be able to issue your own debt as well might be an issue until you get things sort of started. Because there's 1 million people, so essentially it'll have to be domestic institutional investors and superannuation funds, insurance companies, and that will buy those issued securities, as most of them do for the other state governments and a lot for the Commonwealth government as well. So I
think the simplest thing to try and get that sort of stuff is just influx of people. So offer things that other states can't do, like registrations currently are $1,100. Offer $200 registrations. Drop the living expenses out so everyone floods into North Queensland. That's what I think the way forward.
That's what Joby Elkie-Peterson did at one stage, I think, with the death duties, and that just got hit hit off the Gold Coast. Development on the Gold Coast.
Drop the cost of power. Go back to a cost plus CPI. That's what it should be, not not the current thing where they're trying to make $3 billion off their own people.
But I hear what you're saying, Marcus, in terms of where we're at in the current climate right now. And I mean, as I said at the beginning of this show when we were first talking, the resource sector is going to bring Queensland out of its great big horrible debt hole, I believe, as well as any future investment in agriculture, farming, manufacturing, particularly in central North Queensland. And when that happens, I think we're only going to shine. When and if that happens, and of course I have a little bit of a streak of optimism, there's always hope. When that happens, I believe that central North Queensland will just fly and just keep getting better and better, and it will attract, as Brendan said, when the jobs are here and when the lifestyle is here and the opportunities are here, people will come, build it, and they will come.
Certainly. Yep. Yeah. No, I think it's a very promising future. So I know it's been difficult for a few years there, especially with the you had the Yabuli collapsed, and then then after that you had the redundancies at the council, and then at JCU as well. So it was a tough sort of period while I was up there in sort of Townsville. But let's hope there's a lot of projects on the horizon at the moment, and you've got a lot of great advocates and people
And
working
leadership,
around that
yep,
to
and
promote it.
advocacy is what we need, and people who believe it can be done. Yes,
definitely.
yeah,
And
yeah.
Matt Canavan is a great advocate for the resource sector, in Rockhampton there as well. So yeah, I just hope we can get things going as quick as possible. So
yeah,
for sure.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. I think we've reached the end of this interview, Marcus. It's been great having you on the show, and thank you so much for giving up your time. It's very valuable, and I hope down the track that you might return to us and give us some of your forecasts or viewpoints on how we're going and how we're travelling in central North Queensland and indeed the state and the nation. But thanks, Marcus. You're
Sounds
a champ.
Great. Thanks for
Marcus,
the opportunity. Yep, great to have a
thanks
chat.
a lot, Marcus. I learned quite a lot tonight, so it was
great, Brendan.
Yeah, me too.
I hope
Thank you.
people
we'll
listening.
have to chat again.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
No, it was good chat.
You have a great weekend, and we'll talk again soon.
You
Keep
too.
in touch.
Yep.
All right.
Marcus.
Cheers.
Much
Bye.
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 Good night.
That's very good. I learned a lot there. That's it's always good when you've got someone on there, and especially when it was like, we've got an economist on there. I thought, what's this going to be like?
Yeah.
And yeah, that's a wealth of knowledge when you can actually get a bloke to answer questions and come up with viewpoints and all that sort of stuff. It's quite good. So it was very good. I hope everyone enjoyed that.
Yeah, I hope you did.
That was good listening.
I've had the privilege of talking to Marcus for a couple of weeks now, and just talking about figures and developments and stuff. And it's wonderful to have that person that can share perspective about where we're going and how we're headed economically.
And a bit of insider info there, like the fact that and something straight away, the reaction of you and I when the states actually. The way that they get their GST allocated to them is purely through how big their their
public service is.
and it just makes so much sense now. The fact that they don't, no government wants to get less GST, so they're going to continually try and increase their public service, and at the end of the day, that costs you and I more money.
A lot more money too, by the figures,
and that's not against any of the public service. That's just saying that if you're going to be working for public service, obviously we need to be making sure that we're getting bang for buck, and makes a lot more sense. Just
yes, and
if anyone took anything out of that, that's theirs.
I'm led to believe in a lot of the discussions I have too, there's a lot of wastage. So in the public service, and that things could be cleaned up and tightened up and improved dramatically. So that's a whole nother conversation. And but it's good to have an economist on board, and particularly talk about unemployment figures. There's a couple little surprises there and good things too in terms of particularly for Townsville, the overall unemployment rate is forecast not to go any higher, even though I think it's too high as it is. But
for sure.
Particularly youth unemployment, and again that is another discussion to be had down the track. But he was great, he's terrific, and we will bring him back.
Yeah, no, definitely.
Yeah.
All
right.
Too easy. Well, thanks again, Nanette. That's
thank you, Brendan.
Another great interview, and I hope everyone has
enjoy your. What's the weather like out where you are? It's a bit chilly tonight.
Yeah, a bit chilly. The weather.
Are you doing your interview outdoors like you normally do?
No, I'm actually indoors. I'm indoors.
Oh, okay.
So yeah, it's probably Plus, there's no PowerPoints outside, so I've sort of got to be inside.
Yeah, well, you're not at home. Yeah.
No. But yeah, no. Look, it's the weather. Like today, wake up this morning very clear, and late this afternoon there's showers of rain coming across. So it's different weather to back home. So but yeah, no, good weather, and it is quite cold. It does get cold out here. So
well, I'm glad you're enjoying your new role, and
it's good. Yeah, it's very good.
We've got interesting people coming on the show next week. I booked up for the next couple of weeks actually, so you'll have to wait for the promo, but it'll be a good one, guaranteed.
Yeah, definitely. No, there's some good ones coming up, and if people aren't aware of this, we're actually getting people contact us now.
Yeah,
which is really good. As Nanette at the start of the show said, the viewership is actually growing. There's a few extra people, and the good thing is there's people requesting. So some of our audience actually come to us and say, "Oh, you should try and get this person," and then we go, yeah, that'll be a good interview. We flick it across and they come back to us. So, I'd like to, it'd be good to get people like Matt Canavan. If anyone knows him, tell him that we're interested to have a yarn to him. I think he'd enjoy this. I know he does his own podcast, but it'd be good to have him on here. If he's listening or if anyone knows him, tell him to get in touch with us.
And, Brendan and I, our goal is just to make things real, to talk about things realistically and to hear things from the horse's mouth, get perspectives. You can either disagree or agree or challenge or certainly, question, but it's about, getting a message out there and trying to make it as real as possible for everyone who's watching. So thank you very much, viewers. And we hope you have a great weekend and I'll see you next week, I hope.
Yeah, no worries. We'll catch us around and enjoy your weekend. Bye for now.
Bye-bye.
See ya.